Okay, this is to talk about Paul Falstad's simulator in the context of my attempt to construct Eric Dollard's LMD module, daisy-chained, to act as a power supply to augment any input of energy to such a degree that the LMD module concept becomes a secondary voltage source, replacing the need for a very large battery bank, or battery pack, I should say, a bank of batteries. A battery means a bank, a little oxymoron there. A battery of cells in an EV, in an electric car. Now, up until now, my simulations have not been buildable, simply because I didn't know how. And now I know how, because I've learned how to create equivalent series resistance in a coil, in a regulated manner that's actually realistic, that's actually accurate. And that is, I had to look at wire charts, magnetic wire charts. Even Joseph Newman quotes them in his book, The Energy Machine of Joseph Newman. Any edition, the early chapters. He quotes wire diagram charts, and I look it up and I see the exact same figures, and they're standardized. They all say the same thing. Some may vary in terms of how many wire sizes you get to read about, but if you get one that goes as high as 50 gauge, that's pretty good. And you start to see a pattern emerging in which the resistance changes by a factor of 10 for every wire gauge size that's different by 10. Let's see if I got that right. No. Well, yeah, I think. Let me backtrack. So, and then in chapter 6 of his book, Dr. Hastings tells us what the resistance is and what the inductance is of one of Joseph Newman's coils, his table model coil. 50,000 ohms of resistance and 16,000 henries for a very massive coil. And that gives me a relationship of 3.125 of ohms versus henries, which is important to round out this the solution of this mystery of how to put equivalent series resistance into a simulator based on the value alone of the inductance of the inductor. You know, what do I use? Well, it depends on the wire size. If it's such and such a wire size, then you put in so much resistance, otherwise you change it. Well, what I did was I divide the wire size by 10, and then I raise 10 to that power. So let's say the wire size is 20. Divide 20 by 10, it's 2, and then 10 raised to the power of 2, namely 10 squared, is 100. Then I multiply 100 times the conversion factor, which I forget how many zeros in between the decimal point, but it's, I want to guess 3 zeros from my memory, if my memory serves me. 0.000325. So that's multiplied against 100, and then the inductance is multiplied against that. And that gives the series resistance for that particular coil. So it should come out to be 3.125 ohms for a 1 Henry coil in which the coil wire size is 30 gauge, 30 AWG. Apple Wine George. Um, well, nobody sells wire gauges beyond 54 or 56. And in order to make some of my simulations work, I had to use a wire gauge of 70 on the transformer coils and 50 on the motor coils. Well, you're not going to get much current flowing through a 50 gauge wire on a motor coil, and you want current there because you want speed. So we got a few problems. But one of the problems that can alleviate the situation is turn our attention to the capacitor. Now, Wikipedia gives a table on equivalent series resistance of various materials of dielectric used in various capacitors. They never discuss coil equivalent series resistance, so I guess they figured, well, I don't know, they just didn't cover. So it took a few months for me to figure out where equivalent series resistance comes from. It comes from wire size, basically. But for capacitors, it's the dielectric material, and for ceramic, it's 10 milliohms, and it's a fixed value. So if you want something different, you have to change your dielectric to something else. Tantalum oxide, all these different substances that can be used. And they all have different equivalent series resistances. In fact, tantalum is a bit higher than ceramic. So what I'm thinking is that if you end up on a simulation in which you end up with, you want lots of resistance in an LMD module because resistance is your friend. Resistance gives you tremendous back EMF, and that increases the magnification of the buildup of voltage within the LMD module. And something else I learned, that when you look at Paul Falstad's simulation and you scope the transformer and it tells you that voltage is dominating, in reality, it's the voltage of the two capacitors on either side of that transformer coil that are lending the appearance that voltage is ending up on the coil. Likewise, any current showing up on the oscilloscope tracing of a capacitor is actually showing up on either side of the capacitor immediately adjacent to it. So it's inferred, because capacitors block current, so it can't possibly be current on the capacitor, but it is on the immediate vicinity on either side. Acceleration is occurring. Probably due to the capacitor, though. That's why it's showing up there. Probably due to it as a causative factor. Certainly wouldn't be caused by the inductor, because the LMD module is a voltage-oriented phenomenon of amplification of voltage over current, which is okay, because we're going to drain it all out and get tons of current. But during surge mode, it's surging voltage more so than anything else, more so than current. So to obviate, is that the word? Well, let's pick a word I know what the meaning is. To avoid having to go to a large wire gauge, in other words, a very thin wire on the transformer coil of an LMD module, or a RF choke coil, whatever it has to be a coil with a magnetizable core, one way or another. Eric Dollard used RF choke coils, and I don't have that in the Paul Falstad simulator. All I have to work with are air core coils and iron core transformer coils. So I chose to go the route of transformer, and then people say, well, you're not supposed to use a transformer coil. Well, they don't understand, and I didn't understand how to counter their criticism that an RF choke coil is essentially the same thing as a transformer coil, but whatever. To obviate, to avoid the have to use thin wire on the transformer coil, what we do is we turn our attention to the capacitor and choose a dielectric that has a very high equivalent series resistance, because we want negative resistance to occur inside the LMD module, and it's already the coils are already exhibiting this. All you have to do is increase the resistance of the coil by thinning down the wire, and the whole thing gets boosted. Well, the capacitor also needs more resistance too, and it too will probably exhibit greater negative. Well, no, not probably. It will. Simply by the fact that equivalent series resistance in the formula, the mathematical formula modeling capacitance, is in the denominator of a fractional relationship with regard to coils, which are the reciprocals. So whatever the mathematical formula is for a coil, you take the same mathematical formula and take its reciprocal, and that gives you the current for a capacitor, as opposed to current for a coil. Despite the fact that capacitors don't have current, but the current on either side of them, at any rate. So all of the resistance of a capacitor goes into the denominator of that capacitor's mathematical model, which means that resistance now becomes negative resistance, because anytime you either change the sign value of resistance to go from positive to negative, you make it a negative resistor, but you can also make it the reciprocal. You can take the resistance value and put it in the denominator of the mathematical formula for current, and you've put it in a place where it normally is not. It is not normally in the denominator in Ohm's law, it's in the numerator. But in other words, negative resistance is the reciprocal of current in the context of Ohm's law. So that's why we say Mohs law, because we flip it and take the reciprocal, and then it's Mohs law, or Siemens, or conductance, which now that resistor becomes an accelerator of conductance rather than an inhibitor of conductance, which is what a resistor normally does. But in the context of Eric Dollard's LMD module, all resistance in any part of that module becomes negative resistance. So we want lots of resistance, and we want it wherever we can get it. So if we can't get it from increasing, or by diminishing the thickness of the wire wound on the transformer coil, then we turn our attention to the dielectric of a capacitor and try to see what material has a higher equivalent series resistance than the common material of ceramic, which is basically aluminum oxide mixed with other materials, but it's the active ingredient is aluminum oxide. So we look for something else, and tantalum oxide has a higher rating of equivalent series resistance, if my memory serves me correctly. So that means if we what I'm looking to do, well, I don't want to talk about that, but in the terms of building, you're right, okay, in terms of buildability, this is how we think. We have two different factors to juggle, or no, two different tools in our toolbox, let's put it that way, in which to increase resistance within an LMD module. We can thin down the wire in the coil, or we can change the dielectric material of our capacitor to have greater equivalent series resistance to give to make the capacitor, to give it greater boost to the current on either side of it, so that it can really boost the current on either side of it to a much larger degree and help, because if we boost the current, what's going to happen? That current's going to run up against the back EMF of the very resistive coils and create a lot of back EMF, which means it's going to create a lot of resistance, which means it's going to end up creating a lot of voltage. So it's in our favor to choose a dielectrical material for the capacitor within an LMD module of a very high equivalent series resistance value. Or go either route. We've got two different tools in our toolbox for making the LMD module buildable. Now there is resonance, and I'm still not sure what the resonance is between, Bedini says impedance matching. What does that mean in the context of an LMD module? I'm not sure, but I'll tell you one thing. My lightning oscillator is predicated on the silly notion that a simulator doesn't have to worry about equivalent series resistance, and so all the wire and all the coils are superconductors. This is why I went this route of adding equivalent series resistance. It makes things more believable, more buildable, more realistic. But the lightning oscillator, at its point in development, I had to put resistance in there. And I put them quite large. In fact, I think I used 1 gigaohm resistor for each 1 gigahenry coil on the transformers used for the LMD module. So I put a very large resistor there right adjacent to the coil of the same value as the coil itself in terms of units. But when it came time to choose a value of capacitance for the two capacitors of the LMD module in that lightning oscillator, I chose 10 picofarads. No, I did not. I did at first, that's right. But then I raised it to a gigafarad. But then I had to put a resistor alongside that capacitor of 10 pico ohms and a spark gap between them in the form of a neon bulb model of a spark gap. So essentially the resistance of that capacitor then, I made it very low. Yet I put a negative resistor enhancement, namely a spark gap, right next to it, which means I turned that 10 picofarad resistor into a negative resistor, basically. Which means I ended up doing the equivalent of putting a large resistive value inside the capacitor, which I could not do yet. I did not know how to go into the software code. And if I put a large resistor alongside the capacitor, it would simply be a large positive resistor. So by putting a spark gap between a low resistor and a neon bulb's spark gap, spark gap, I ended up doing the same thing as putting a large resistance, equivalent series resistance, into that capacitor, which means it's no longer a ceramic capacitor, it's some other kind with a much higher equivalent series resistance within its dielectric material. So you see what I was doing, but now I can analyze what I did. And I've been telling people all along, simulators don't lie, you just have to know how to interpret them. And it's no small affair, because you've got to know your electrodynamic theory down pat. And who does? Even the way it's taught in school, nobody really understands it very well. They just know enough to get by, basically, and get paid to do their work, and not much else. But it's corporate style work, obviously. It's not over unity style work, which would be bad for the economy, bad for banking. The Federal Reserve would no longer be the sole outlet for issuing fiat currency if everybody creates their own power, by augmenting an unlimited supply, an unlimited augmentation of a limited power supply, because that's what over unity amounts to. It's not something from nothing, but it is unlimited augmentation of a limited power supply. And we know we have a limited power supply, we know this. But we can effectively unlimitedly boost our limited power supply. And this is what the Federal Reserve does. It takes currency that we already have and augments it by creating more currency. If there were no Federal Reserve dollars in circulation, it wouldn't mean anything to create any. That's why they had to issue them initially in terms of silver backing. And it made them look acceptable, but it infused an initial amount into the system. And that's the amount they put in those first 20 years of the Federal Reserve's existence is the only amount of monetary energy that's still in the money supply. It hasn't changed in all these years because they haven't issued any more silver-backed Federal Reserve certificates, into circulation. All the subsequent years after the first 20 has been dollars backed by zip, backed by the other dollars already in circulation. So the actual amount of value in this in circulation has never changed, but the dollars meant to denominate that value has changed, and that's why we get inflation, because of the devaluation of that value behind the dollar. Let's see what else. So yeah, so it'd be kind of bad for the economy, which does not mean our quality of life would go down. It would simply have to change very radically to no longer be based on money changing hands. Money would be very unimportant at that point. Sharing would be more important, basically. Sharing with your neighbor. But how do you do long distance? Chile. If Argentina or Chile wants to, the country of Chile, down in South America, wants to grow produce out of season for us Norte Americanos, how do you ship it and pay for it with a currency that's no longer globalized? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Anyway, well, I'll tell you how you get into your UFO-style craft and you go shopping in Argentina for your tomatoes, and then you come back here with them and make your salad. After a short trip, at 4,000 miles an hour, it doesn't take long to get to South America from here and back again, in time to make your salad for your lunch and have fresh-picked tomatoes from Argentina out of season. You see, it's not that hard to figure these things out. It's just that one problem, or one solution, I should say, one radical solution, one radical in the sense that it changes the socio-economic condition of our culture in a radical manner, requires changing other areas. You can't just change one area out of context. You have to change all of them at the same pace, more or less, so as not to shock the system, namely us, our collective awareness. Let's see, I think I've covered everything. So I've had a lot of fun recently finally discovering how to do equivalent series resistance in a coil, and now that inspires me to do some more work. I don't want to talk about the work because I'm not looking forward to it. But anyway, so take that and run with it. So we have the LMD module, and we can do just about anything we want with it to make it perform the way I've always suspected that it can perform for the 5 years since I first started suspecting that we can use it as a secondary voltage source to replace the battery bank inside of our electric cars. I suspected it, but I didn't know how, and now I can say with a good deal of certainty I know how. It's not that hard. And it's, the details are just that, details. But the theme, the conceptualization of the overall thematic view of the situation is pretty, it's not that complicated, just as long as we know all the parts. To the tools, to the factors that we have to vary, that we have available to vary. We don't have to vary them, but we might as well take advantage of the knowledge to give us everything we need to know to make it buildable. A buildable circuit with off-the-shelf parts. Nothing exotic. Not that exotic won't improve efficiency. Tesla was well known for creating exotic circuits, but he was going for efficiency. He already had the thing down pat, but he was already improving efficiency. That comes later for most of us. We're still taking our baby steps into Tesla's world, and this is over a century later, barely figure the guy out. So efficiency can come later, but the first baby step is to try to replicate Tesla in a non-efficient manner, but at least get it done, get it built and get it working, a working model. And the simulator does help if we understand what it represents. And I don't mean that in a broad way, now I mean it in a detailed way, what all its components mean, and how to interpret the simulator's the behavior of the simulator's components. And that's really what the simulator's purpose is, to train our mind in how to think properly on electrodynamic theory in conjunction with the materials of construction, which is more than just copper and aluminum. It also has to do with wire size. Who would know? Who would have guessed? Geometry, the geometry of construction. Who would have guessed? Still, I never would have guessed. Wire size was a geometric factor, a significant one. Who would have guessed? Well, now I know. And now you know. Here's another tantalizing thought for the construction of an LMD module. And it comes inspired from Lee Rogers. He created a means by which he could take compressed air tanks and run his car off of compressed air alone, and then eventually he figured out how to compress the air while the car was in motion, provided he never drove slower than 20 miles per hour, at which point the whole system would stall on him. And he lived in Florida, okay, at sea level, where the air pressure is quite high. But he was able to, and a layer of ice would develop on the surface of his engine, because, it's a gasoline engine modified to run on compressed air, basically, which is not the most efficient way to do things, but, he managed to figure it out. And compress air while he was driving to refill his tanks. And he had 4 tanks, and while one was draining, the other 3 were being filled. And so I'm thinking to myself, likewise, if we had 2 or more LMD daisy-chained modules, while one is draining to supply power to the motor coils, one or more others could be surging to build up their voltage. And then you just rotate them. It's kind of like the Bedini model of charging batteries, in which you have one battery as your drain running the circuit, and then you have a bank of batteries that you're recharging, and then you rotate your batteries, and you get enough energy out of the system from your batteries to run various things, but you also recharge your batteries at the same time. You have to rotate them. Well, it's the same concept. It's drain and surge separated into different sections of the circuit, and so you have to rotate what is undergoing and swap what is undergoing drainage versus what is undergoing surge. Surge being, in this case, recharge, and drain being charge. Excuse me, drain being discharge. So when I say drain, I mean discharge, and when I say surge, I mean charge or recharge, as the case may be. So it makes it very easy then to run a motor off of this concept. But there has to be a mechanism, probably a computer, to figure out, okay, now we got to switch LMD modules because this one's done draining enough, and this one is done surging, and so now I got to switch between them to keep constant power supply being supplied to the motor coils. So, of course, surges don't take long. I mean, you can engineer it to take any length of time you want. Drainage takes a fixed time based on how much you've got collected within that surged LMD module of prior surge, that went through a prior surge. But a surge itself takes very little time, so that's why I didn't think I needed to rotate. But if you don't rotate, then you got a hiccup of energy, and that's not the best thing in the world to do. Maybe it's okay for a prototype to show proof of concept, but the finished product should have swap between them multiple daisy-chained LMD module systems. Probably no more than 2, because it doesn't take that long to surge the thing. So most of the time, one of it would be held in waiting while you Well, but see, there's no such thing as waiting. There's no fence sitting with a surge versus drain oriented system. You're either surging or draining, and there's no way to stay in between. Unless, well, in a way you can, by using a dummy motor coil, which is not undergoing any load, right? Any mechanical loads. So, that's right. So you would basically have a freewheeling motor coil that is free to spin, and that becomes a synchronous generator when it's free to spin, which will actually help in a very large way. Act as a flywheel in more ways than one. Not only is it a magnetic flywheel, but it's a mechanical flywheel as well. So I knew I had to put a flywheel into the system, and now I know how to do it by having a second motor. So the clutch is important. So the clutch engages one motor at a time, and that's how we swap with a clutch, with a manual clutch, in which the clutch toggles between motors. So you have two motors. One is actually driving the car, and one is free spinning, serving as a magnetic flywheel as well as a mechanical flywheel. And then you switch between them. And each one has its own LMD daisy chain power supply. Cool. So you just swap between them, back and forth. And now we've got a Bedini Tesla switch, because instead of batteries that we're switching back and forth between, it's this LMD and motor coil combination. Because I can't separate. See, Ken Wheeler figured that, unfortunately learned this. I can't separate the motor coil from the LMD daisy chain. Both get surged at the same time, and both drain at the same time. So that's why we need two motors and two LMD daisy chain power supplies, one for each, and we swap between them as we drive along. And my car already has two motors in it, oddly enough. They're DC motors, though, not AC, and I don't know if they're universal motors or not, but I'm pretty sure they're DC motors. I don't know if they're brush or brushless either. I don't know too much about the motors in my car. But there are two motors, and that's why the battery pack is double, 288 volts, at least when it was built. At the moment it doesn't have that, or else I'd be driving it around. But it does have two motors, so maybe it's already set up, for modification. Could be. I mean, you don't need two motors. You can get by on one, but it'll be a hiccup of a driving experience, because you won't be able to. You'll have to coast, and going up a hill you can't coast. Can't afford to. So that's right. So you do need two motors to be able to go up a hill or accelerate into traffic when it's at that moment in time when you have to switch. You can't go and surge, when you're trying to accelerate. In the middle of an acceleration, let's put it that way. You've already started your acceleration, and now you gotta surge your circuit. No, it's not going to happen. So you need two motors and two power supplies, one for each. Okay, solve that problem. Well, I have a little update to make. A little embarrassed. In my exuberance, I talked about a concept before I actually tested it, and I'm finding out it's not true. And that concept that I wish to correct by this update is that, what was it again? Oh, I spoke of, well, if we need negative resistance in the circuit, and we need it to a certain, in the LMD module, and we need it to a certain degree for it to function. And if it doesn't, if we can't pragmatically build it using wire gauge of a very high value, then we turn our attention to make up the difference to the capacitors, the central capacitors, the two capacitors, the pair of capacitors in each LMD module of a daisy chain of them. And that's not right. That's not true. Actually, what happens is if you start playing with the capacitor, if you start playing with the equivalent series resistance of the capacitors within the limits of what's available, or the actual dielectric material that's available, you can't really affect anything. Nothing happens. You can't change it enough. In order to change it, you have to change it to an extreme value, which does not exist. You know, something like, what was it, 10,000 ohms or more, or in the opposite extreme, I think, but I'm not sure, I can't remember. I'm not clear on that, because I was trying low values as well, but I don't think that worked. It had to be high, extremely high, not just a little high. See, I thought it could be a little high, and it doesn't work that way. For a capacitor, it would have to be extremely high, and that doesn't exist. So I turned my attention back to the coils, and I realized, and I tried, well, at first, before I realized what to do, I tried increasing the inductance on the coils, and that created instability of the system, because then it wanted to surge all the time, or it wanted to surge when it was draining rather than when it was surging. It was really bizarre the way the circuit started to behave. So I had to go back to the wire gauge alone as a regulating factor, and I reinvestigated what I had you know, I kind of gave a quick modification to the circuit, because I was trying to match the resistance on the transformer coils and on the 1 Henry motor coils, and I didn't do a very accurate job, because when I switched from one model of equivalent series resistance to another, when I made changes to the simulator, I didn't really keep track of what I was doing, because I had a different model. The prior model was, you know, the 4MO version of the simulator. It had the area of a circle representing the cross-section of a coil of wire as my model, and that model didn't work. Well, I mean, no, it worked, but it didn't have, it wasn't the way things work in the real world. So that's why I had to switch to wire size. But in so doing, I altered the resistance on the coils, and it didn't pay attention to what degree did I alter them, so that when it comes time to run these particular, or this one particular circuit simulation, the two LMDs Flint, is.gd/2 LMDs Flint, TWO LMDS FLINT, and it's two similar circuits, the 50 amp version and the 220 amp version of 300 volts pre-charged to not just the large size capacitor pre-charged, but the whole circuit. I didn't pay attention, so I looked more closely at the two versions of simulations of that particular circuit, because I wanted at least this latest circuit to comply with the upgrade of software, the simulator software. So I took a closer look, and I realized I had to be more accurate. So instead of my suggestion of 70 AUG wire gauge on the transformer coil, it had to be 61, because 70 actually created instability, and it wanted to surge. After several times of altering, draining and surging, or surging and draining for that matter, the circuit, it became unstable and then wanted to surge all the time, even when it was draining. So that's why I had to reduce that. And then the motor coils, the 1 Henry motor coils, I only changed it slightly. That was the one I was paying attention to, unfortunately. So I only had to change it to 51 og wire size, from 50 to 51. 51 became the new value. Well, so 61 isn't as bad as 70 in terms of a custom-made wire specifically made just for this simulation, because I'm not sure anybody sells 61. They might. I know they sell up to 56, either 54 or 56. But 61 might be a little easier to come by, possibly. But it does have to be specific, at least in terms of the simulation. In terms of real life, it could be something obviously different than that. The simulator can only suggest where to look. It can't dictate, because it's still only a simulation and does not take everything in the real world into account. So I'm sure there are simulators out there that are very accurate, that industry uses, not the ones that are used in, I'm not suggesting the ones that are used in universities like microcap, because they have policies against surges, so that won't work. In terms of accuracy, that's not accurate. When you institute a policy against what we observe in nature, then it's no longer accurate. You have to say accurate for what, for what purpose? So for the purpose of manufacturing stuff, it ain't accurate. Microcap doesn't even come close if it's busy suppressing surges, and LT-Spice isn't any better. Well, it's only slightly better, actually. Yeah, it is slightly better, but it's still not accurate. LT-Spice just makes it difficult to develop a surge. It doesn't make it impossible. And by making it difficult, it makes it impossible to manage, which makes it not practical, which is not useful at all. So I don't know, maybe, for all I know, Paul Falstad's simulator, or my modification of it, let's put it that way, for the purposes of allowing surges to occur and encouraging their development in circuit design software, such as a simulator, it's the only accurate software I know of, and I don't know of too many. I'm hoping that there is something available out there that is accurate, but I really don't know. It may not exist. The corporate model of policies monkeying with our observation of what nature actually does, whatever, it's very dismaying to think that thought, but it may be true. So anyway, I had to make this update because I was wrong. It's actually very complicated, and the only problem, see, this is the problem I have, is that it's hard for me to reconcile the fact that nature can't encourage surges, because all of creation would explode if that were the case, if it were that easy to create a surge, because everything in nature does have an electrical analog to it, apart from anything else happening, mechanical or chemical. And so when you start to explain something strictly, or regulate something strictly in terms of, or model it strictly in terms of its electrodynamics, the logic is, or the common sense logic that I would derive is that, or assume, is that you can't have, nature can't have surges happening willy-nilly, or else everything would explode, and that would be the creation wouldn't last very long. So she has to discourage them. She has to suppress them. Not just any policies of the corporate mindset to prevent over-unity from messing up our economic model of the economy being strictly regulated by the Federal Reserve or by central banks of any country, and not by people in their garages, garage mechanics, inventors coming up with their own over-unity circuits to run their EVs off of in their homes. It has to be something more than that, just for the sanity and the safety and the welfare of creation. So that's why I have to question whether or not my proposition, my general proposition that it is possible to create over unity circuits that can surge, whether or not that's actually possible. I don't know. But because my only problem is stability of the circuit. It's not hard to create a surge. It's a little harder when there's equivalent series resistance in the coils, especially, not so much in the caps. In the caps there's a slight advantage, but the main problem is in the coil. That's where usually, strictly speaking, equivalent series resistance is positive resistance in a coil. But when you put that coil with that newfound positive resistance that was not there prior in many simulators, including microcap, you have to add it alongside. Well, no, in LT-Spice it's actually there by default, a default value, an arbitrary default value, a fixed value, which has nothing to do with wire size and inductance value of the coil. But you can go in there and change it if you know what to put in. And I guess they're assuming you simply measure the coil and put it in. You don't presume to guess what it is based on wire size and inductance, while I would prefer to do that. Makes things a whole lot easier for me, so that then I don't have to measure an actual coil. Where was I going? I lost my train of thought. Anywho, so I'm doing the best I can, given the fact that I don't have anything in the real world to look at. Oh, yeah. How easy is it in the real world to create a surge? So my main problem is stability, because it is so easy to create a surge and so difficult to manage it. And so that's where my focus has been for over a year, is manageability as well as usability. It should be useful. You shouldn't have randomized spikes. You should have nice, more or less, DC flatline outputs or AC output. And most of my outputs have been DC in their appearance, although they actually have compressed AC inside of them. I think I've said this already. So to make it look like DC from a macroscopic point of view, which might be pass as being passably acceptable for a motor coil to accept that. It may not, it may vibrate the motor, but whatever. So I don't know, my doubt starts to creep in at different points. Are my circuit ideas actually realistic in my presumption of them being realistic? But I keep trying. I keep trying to make them realistic. The problem, although the problem of it, somebody just flatly denying whether or not, in general, whether or not a surge-oriented circuit can exist, that's hard to accept on its face, without arguing that, well, until you build it, you do not know. We do not know. I don't know, and you don't know either. Nobody knows. Because this concept of the LMD module has never been investigated. So, but parametric oscillations has been. So there's enough of an argument to make for, well, let's give it a try at least. And then if they're just, then it becomes, or should become, well, they're just not interested in being involved. They'd rather be doing something else. So fine, then I'm talking to the wrong people. If you're not interested, then then that's different. If you don't think it's worth your while because you don't think it'll work, that's different. But I'm interested in finding out, and unless I get onto some simulator that has no policy in it but is accurate along the same lines of reasoning that my modification of Paul Fosted's simulator is accurate, wire gauge size, equivalent series resistance, and yet does a better job than what I've managed to cobble together recently, then I'm all for looking to see if that simulation is any more successful than mine are, but only if it does not have any policies written into its software code. It shouldn't have any policies at all, zero. Forget about the welfare of trying to prevent something from happening that you don't want to happen, because there's no way to find out then if the circuit is buildable, if something like that gets in the way. And I'm afraid they are there, but they may not be. I'm trying to be positive-minded. Maybe there is a simulator out there that has no policy whatsoever, but is more accurate than my modification of Paul Fosted's simulator, and I'll leave it at that. But to flatly deny the potential of this concept of the LMD module as a amplifying methodology, it's really a personal issue that the person would have. I have to take it as being, they may be right, but I don't know that. They may be wrong. And I'm being hopeful that they are wrong, even though I suspect that I may be wrong, But being automatically doubtful on my part is just as bad as somebody else who's very fully qualified automatically doubting, because qualification alone is not enough. Because have they dealt with Eric Dollard's LMD module as a boosting circuit for the purposes of boosting, amplifying energy? In a parametric matter, or in any matter, just plain and simple. If they have that background specifically, then it's a waste of time to deal with them, and a waste of their time too, as well as mine. So, anywho.